horseshoe is our next logical operator. And so horseshoes, again, deal with if-then statements, conditional statements. So I might tell you, if today is Tuesday, then my assignment is due. Now, the key to understanding how the horseshoe works is to understand that the horseshoe will always go in the place that the word then would go in the sentence, if it has one. And so what this turns into is T horseshoe D, T standing for today is Tuesday, D standing for my assignment is due. So what T horseshoe D says is, if today is Tuesday, then my assignment is due. Now, as I think we already know, there are a variety of ways to express conditional statements, one of which is to put what we call the consequent, if you remember that, the consequent at the beginning of the sentence and the antecedent, part of the conditional statement that comes after the word if, put it at the end of the sentence like we see here. My assignment is due if today is Tuesday. Now the key here, and it's very important because this trips people up all the time, is to understand that what comes to the left-hand side of that horseshoe, right? So right here, this T, what comes right there is always, always going to be the antecedent of the conditional statement we're translating. So in other words, that T here represents today is Tuesday. And so this second statement here, my assignment is due if today is Tuesday, gets translated exactly the same way as the original does. T horseshoe D. All right. Now, what I've just been talking to you about, though, is the word if, right? If. Here we have a different sentence. This assignment is late only if the instructor changed the due date. So the key to recognize here is that the two words only if get translated a bit differently from just the word if. So if I tell you that this assignment is late only if the instructor changed the due date, in fact, we want to put the horseshoe right where the only if went. So the way we would read L horseshoe C here is essentially, right, if the assignment is late, then the instructor changed the due date. That's one way we could read L horseshoe C. Now, to say if the assignment is late, then the instructor changed the due date is, again, simply to say this assignment is late only if the instructor changed the due date. All right, again, just to remind you, there is a complete list here at the end of 5.1. And so I'm just going to actually turn to that. I have the book here on my iPad. And so I'm looking at the end of 5.1. And we see here a very long list of words and phrases that the horseshoe is used to translate. So, for example, we see the word implies. Okay? Implies works just as only if does. So I'll just put it this way. Implies works like only if, okay, like the phrase only if. And so when you see a sentence, for example, we could just replace this one here. This assignment is late implies that the instructor changed the due date. This assignment is late implies that the instructor changed the due date. You would again end up with L horseshoe C, as you see here. Continuing on this list at 5.1, at the end of that, we have the next one is given that. Given that. Okay, so what we need to understand there given that, there's another one that follows it. In case. Provided that. On condition that. Here's the key. Each one of these phrases means if. Each one of them means if. to illustrate, right? If I said the Seahawks are in the playoffs given that they win today's game, what that means is the Seahawks are in the playoffs if they win today's game. If I were to say the Seahawks are in the playoffs in case they win today's game, that means if they win today's game, they're in the playoffs. If I tell you the Seahawks are in the playoffs provided that they win today's game, I'm again saying if they win today's game, then they're in the playoffs. And finally, just to complete the package here, if I told you that the Seahawks are in the playoffs on condition that they win today's game, what I'm saying is if they win today's game, then they're in the playoffs. So I hope you got all that. Any of these phrases means if. They're all equivalent to the word if. Perhaps more importantly, though, please remember, the way we do these translations is that whatever follows the word if, or anything that means if, goes in the antecedent position, right? So right here, where we see that T, that's the antecedent. Whatever follows the word if, or anything that means if, goes on the left side of a horseshoe. And then what goes on the right side of the horseshoe will be the consequent. Okay. Now, if you're noticing here, if you're looking at that list at the end of section 5.1, you'll see that the list goes on beyond what I've just been reading, because then it talks about sufficient and necessary conditions. And then at the very end of this little blurb here in the book, it says, do not confuse antecedent with consequent. And of course, that is the case. Let me just emphasize that point. An example. All right. So, if I told you that a little darker, okay. If it's a cat, then it's a mammal, right? I could say if it's a cat, then it's a mammal. Great. However, if I had reversed it, right, if I had the M, the consequent over here where the antecedent is supposed to be, and I had reversed it, now I'd be saying if it's a mammal, then it's a cat. Of course, these two things do not mean the same thing. If it's a cat, then it's a mammal is true. If it's a mammal, then it's a cat is false, right? So the point there at the end of that translation box, when he says, do not confuse antecedent with consequent, is simply don't get these mixed up. There's only one right way for these two pieces to be around or arranged around the horseshoe. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. And so to do that, we can go back to 1.2, and that's exercise set 6, and we can actually practice this. And I'm just going to pull that up here real quick. And so we will see there some examples that deal with filling in a blank with necessary or sufficient conditions. And the first one that I want to look at is number 2, where it says that being an animal is a blank condition for being a tiger. So being an animal is a blank condition for being a tiger. So we're going to fill that in with either necessary or sufficient, and in order to make that statement true. So if we filled it in with